is to help prepare. And I will say this is like a first step, and this will probably be unsatisfying. I will say that up front, because there's in no way in a couple hours that we can cover every possible thing. What I will say is my goal is to give you some high level things to think about, questions to ask, considerations. You'll hear from some folks that have had experience, and then to really put it into practice, because that's the only way you really, I say, get good and build those skills necessary to make sure that your work and capacity and technical assistance will serve the communities that you're working with. So this is just a start. It's like a 101. But I think it's important, before we even dig into the conversation again, is that there are some key definitions, or, kind of level setting, and the way that I'm going to use this terminology that I want to put out there up front. There are a lot of different definitions that many folks have, many organizations hold on to, but I just want to share with you the way that I'm thinking about it and how it'll be expressed through this presentation. So when I think about environmental justice, again, I rely on the Environmental Protection Agency's definition. Again, in the Jalan version, that everybody deserves to live in a place that is healthy and safe, and policies and regs should make that happen. Bias is something, again, that we sometimes hold these ways of thinking about people and communities, and that can actually augment how we relate in community, or relate to the folks and communities that we're serving. So it's very important to understand your biases, or really begin to think about what's the bias that I might be bringing into this engagement or conversation. And so again, thinking about bias is super important as you think about our aspirations of equity. Racism, again, a lot of different definitions, but it is really, kind of cruxed in power and oppression, and sometimes, again, white supremacy. So really being cognizant of, if we are going to talk about equity and justice and research and science and policy, that we have to be aware that racism exists at the individual level, at the systemic level, and at the institution level. And so how are you creating solutions and ways of approaching things that might be able to address those different levels of racism? Power. Again, the fact that I would say either the majority of you, and tell me if I'm wrong, or some now, have been in some part of your life associated with an institution, whether it be government, academia, private industry. I know I've had my fair share, philanthropy, again. So there's a certain amount of power that is ascribed to your institutional connection. And being aware of that, particularly when you are coming into a new community for the first time, is very important, because again, it sets up a dynamic that could be uncomfortable and make people unsafe for many reasons, and we'll get into that. But in the center of this slide, I purposely put racial equity, because in many sense, just as environmental justice is the aspiration, that is the goal, racial equity is the goal. I truly believe that we want to get to a point where race does not dictate, again, how healthy you are, your access to education, all those different pieces. So that is my hope for what we're shooting for in the work. So, I think it's important for you to understand kind of a little bit of where I come from, not just Southeastern Michigan, but how I come to this work and how I came to this work. And I want to really start with an example of how I got into, like, I would say, legitimate research and advocacy. And it really starts with my grandparents, who are pictured in the upper left-hand corner. They are both in heaven now, but in their 80s and 90s, I was their primary caregiver. So I did the shopping, took them to the grocery store, doctor's appointments, a little bit of everything. But at that time, I was actually working with the Detroit Health Department, because they had this question around, extreme heat and how it was impacting some of their low-income seniors and some of the few high rises that we have in the city of Detroit. And so they asked me to come on and help them explore this question. And part of the way that I approached it was really beginning by building relationships with seniors across the city. So I hung out at activity centers, I hung out at churches, I went to a couple of, walks, for, I think, one to end Alzheimer's and a couple others, but really tried to intersperse myself in finding communities of seniors that, again, were really focused maybe on other topics, whether it be health and wellness or things of that nature, and to really kind of understand what their concerns are, particularly in the city of Detroit, in the particular neighborhoods that the health department was interested in. And so from that, I was able to build relationships and really begin to bring in, I would say, my agenda of saying, okay, so if you're, again, concerned with health and the cost of electricity and things of this nature, there's another thing that I would like to, again, offer you is really understanding how extreme heat may or may not be impacting you. And so from those initial kind of relationship buildings, I was able to recruit 30 or 40 seniors to let me come into their homes every week and put in temperature monitors in their home in several rooms and have conversation and document their behaviors to deal with extreme heat, particularly during the summertime. And so I would say from that interaction, that initial relationship building and kind of collecting data over several summers, there was definitely some papers that were generated. It definitely helped me, complete my doctoral research and my dissertation and all that good stuff. But there were a bunch of other things that came out of it. And it was the fact that many of the seniors, that I worked with and some that I still talk to today, appreciated the companionship. They appreciated the fact that they didn't even think that extreme heat was an issue. In many cases, they didn't know that they were experiencing heat stress. And so I would go in some cases, with them to their doctor's appointments. They received a little bit of compensation from being a part of the study that for low-income seniors, when you think about the cost of food and medicine, that was helpful. But I would say the thing that really, still moved me was the fact that, it helped in the advocacy. And one of my seniors was stuck on the 18th floor of this high rise. She had, she was differently able, had an oxygen tank, and her landlord would not let her move to a lower level of this 18th floor high rise. But because of some of the data that we collected during the summer showing that the temperature extremes in her little apartment were over 98 degrees consistently, using that data and having conversations with this landlord, Mrs. Jones was able to move to the first floor of her apartment complex. And that was a battle that she had been fighting for multiple years to try and convince this landlord that this was not safe and this was not good. And so to me, that is the power of, first of all, building relationship, using research for good and action and good policy, actually changing folks' lives. So, I think I heard somebody. Or maybe not. Okay, I'll keep on going, but please let me know if I'm missing a hand or something. But I also want to talk about the fact that sometimes research in a community's perspective doesn't really amount to enough. And I bring up the zip code of 48217. And for those of you that might not be aware, this is kind of known as Michigan's most polluted zip code that has multiple sources, whether it be wastewater treatment plant, industry, refineries, a little bit of everything. And, while this zip code has been well studied, meaning there have been multiple academic institutions that spend time, have collected data, put in monitors, these folks are still suffering majorly. And the health ramifications of the exposures over time have not gone anywhere. And so oftentimes, and I just pulled together a community meeting a couple of months ago in this zip code, and folks are tired of being studied and it not amounting to anything. And so when you think about the importance of research and how it can be used to drive, again, policy and advocacy, what you all are doing and providing is important, but also knowing the context of the community that you're coming into. So it might be a community, again, that has been over-surveyed, over-researched, and hasn't really seen the benefits of the research or the surveying. Or it might be the fact that communities remember, again, some of the historical atrocities that have happened with research, particularly with the Tuskegee syphilis study, and that, again, it was unethical. There were no benefits to the African-American folks that unfortunately were a part of this study. And many of the things that we see today, again, stem from these historical atrocities around research and the mistrust of research and scientists and government coming into community. So it's important to, again, really think about what that means when you go into these communities and begin to do the research and work and technical assistance that you do. But I also want to take it to the policy perspective, because again, when I was working with WEAC for Environmental Justice, and many of the organizations, many environmental justice organizations had a problem with a couple of policies that a lot of mainstream environmental organizations were supporting, one being cap and trade, just as an example. And again, what was striking to me is that it wasn't just that the community, the environmental justice communities were pushing back on this policy one time. It had been over multiple years. But in many ways, the environmental justice community was not heard. And their concerns, their research that really kind of pushed this case of, can cap and trade be beneficial to communities when you're just shipping pollution to another source? So really thinking about, what are the implications of the research? What are the implications of the policy prescriptions? And what that really means to communities, whether it's intentional or unintentional consequences. And so what I want to say is that, there was an opportunity where communities were able to kind of shake it up. And we were able to, again, provide, again, an equity analysis or an environmental justice analysis to really support, at this time, the Clean Power Plan and the federal government, kind of moving in a way that recognized that some of these technical solutions aren't the best. And not saying that we don't want the solution, but at least look at it from our perspective and make sure that what you're offering or what you're prescribing takes into our considerations and our concerns. And so, again, as we think about the importance of research and technical assistance and what it can and could mean in communities, it's, again, important to understand that, and I show this because part of my advocacy has also been around water equity recently. And again, there has been data taken, government being involved, local government in this case, but there are certain communities that continue to get slammed, particularly with flooding. But again, the research and the data and the technical assistance still does not provide certain communities with the protection that's needed. So I say all this to say that, these are some of the situations that you might be coming into. And having that awareness, having that not only cultural competency, but the fact that there have been, cases where there's been limited accountability by institutions and organizations that were supposed to, again, stand up and protect these communities. The fact that there has been trust that has been broken. The fact that in many ways, decision-making around what policies are right or wrong has not been shared. And that oftentimes the goals of agencies or institutions or folks that are coming in to help, those goals are not aligned with the goals of the community. So for me, science and advocacy cannot be done without a racial justice or equity orientation, or it can be detrimental. So I want to pause there and just maybe get your thoughts,